Montana, winter 1883. A stranger just collapsed across her doorstep, bleeding out, gun still holstered. Clara didn't step back. She pressed the rifle barrel straight to his face. Kick it away. He looked up at her eyes glazed with pain, but sharp enough to understand one thing. This woman wasn't bluffing. He kicked the gun across the floor. She tied his hands to the bed frame, dressed the wound, saved his life. What she didn't know yet, he'd been hired to find her. And the man who sent him was far more dangerous than any Montana blizzard. This is the story of a woman who was never truly powerless. She was just waiting for the right moment. Stay with us because it starts right now. The blizzard hit Montana the way bad news always did, without warning. And all at once, Clara Vance stood at the frost-laced window, watching the wall of white swallow the tree line whole. The pines had been there an hour ago. Now, there was nothing, just wind and noise, and the kind of dark that pressed against the glass like it wanted inside. She let the curtain fall. The cabin was small. One room, one door, one window. She knew every creak in the floorboards and every gap in the chinking where the cold crept through. She'd spent 3 weeks learning this place the way a prisoner learns their cell, not from comfort, but from necessity. The rifle was on the table. It was always on the table. She sat down beside it and pulled her shawl tighter and went back to work on the ledger entries she was copying by lamplight. Numbers, names, dates, proof. The original was hidden in a place Elias Sterling would never think to look, because Elias Sterling had never once looked at her as someone capable of outthinking him. That was his first mistake. The wind screamed. The timbers groaned. Clara kept writing. Then she heard it. 3 knocks. Weak. Slow. Like the person knocking wasn't sure they had the strength to try a 4th. Her pen stopped. She sat very still for a moment, listening hard beneath the howl of the storm. Nothing followed. No voices. No boots on the porch boards. Just the wind doing what wind does. She picked up the rifle, not quickly, not in a panic. She rose from the chair with the calm deliberateness of someone who had already imagined this moment 100 times and had decided, long before tonight, exactly what she would do. She crossed to the door. "Who's there?" Her voice was flat and clear. A sound came back. Something between a groan and a word. It didn't resolve into anything useful. Clara pressed her back against the wall, beside the doorframe. She lifted the latch with her left hand. The door blew inward with a gust that nearly knocked the lamp off the table. A man fell across the threshold. He went down hard, face first, one arm reaching forward like he'd been trying to crawl the last few feet. Snow poured in around him. He was big, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long trail duster that was dark with blood along the left side. A revolver sat in the holster at his hip. Clara didn't move from her position beside the door. The rifle was up, aimed. She waited. He turned his head slowly. The lamplight caught his face jaw like cut stone. A few days of dark stubble. Eyes that were glassy with pain, but still sharp enough to register the gun barrel pointing at him. He blinked. "Kick it away," Clara said. He didn't pretend not to understand. His right hand moved in a slow, deliberate arc toward his holster. He unsnapped the leather, pinched the grip between 2 fingers, and slid the revolver across the floorboards. It spun to a stop near the far wall. "Hands where I can see them," she said. He flattened both palms against the floor. She stepped around him in a wide circle, keeping distance, keeping the rifle steady. She kicked the door shut behind him. The noise of the storm dropped by half. She grabbed the revolver off the floor and tucked it into the back of her waistband. Then she crouched down beside him and checked his coat for a second weapon. Found a hunting knife sheathed at his belt. She took that too. He watched her do it. He didn't say a word. "Can you get onto the bed?" she asked. "Maybe. Try." It took him a while. He dragged himself up by grabbing the bedpost. And she watched the whole effort without helping him. She stood back. She let him work. Not because she was cruel, but because she'd learned the hard way that a man with enough strength to fake weakness could use a moment of kindness like a weapon. He made it. He collapsed onto the mattress with a sound low in his throat, the involuntary kind that people make when pain wins. Clara set the lantern on the nightstand and studied him. He was losing blood. The left side of his coat was soaked through, and there was a puddle forming on her mattress. And she didn't have a great many options here. Leave him to die, or try to save him. If she saved him, she needed him contained. Simple math. She went to the chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a length of rope. "I'm going to tie your hands to the bed frame," she said. "Both of them, above your head." His eyes found hers. There was pain in them, and something else, what might have been respect, or what might have been surprise. Hard to tell with a stranger. "All right," he said. "You understand I'll shoot you if you fight me." "Yes, ma'am." She tied the knots tight. She knew how to do that, too. Another thing she'd taught herself in 3 weeks of solitude, along with how to skin a rabbit and how to read the snow for tracks. When his wrists were secure, she opened his coat to look at the wound. Gunshot, entry wound. Upper left side, no exit. The bullet was still in him. She sat back on her heels and exhaled slowly. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I expect so," he said. She got up and put a pot of water on the fire. The blizzard howled. The lamp burned low, and somewhere out in the dark, past the tree line that had gone invisible in the snow, whoever had shot this man was still moving. She'd deal with that later. Right now, she had work to do. The bullet came out at 3 in the morning. Clara had spent 2 hours deciding whether to try. She wasn't a doctor. She had a sewing kit, a bottle of whiskey, a hunting knife, and a set of instructions she'd read once in a medical pamphlet she found tucked inside a copy of Godey's Lady's Book at a house she'd rather forget. The pamphlet was for field surgeons. She wasn't a field surgeon either, but the man was still alive, and the bullet was still in him, and one of those two facts was going to have to change before morning. She chose the bullet. She sterilized the knife blade in the whiskey, poured a measure over the wound while he was half conscious, and listened to him suck air through his teeth and go white under his stubble. She worked by lamplight with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and when it was over, she sat on the floor beside the bed with her back against the frame and her hands shaking in her lap. And she stayed there until the shaking stopped. He slept. She didn't. By the time pale gray light started leaking through the frost on the window, Clara had washed her hands twice, brewed coffee she couldn't taste, and placed his weapons, the revolver and the hunting knife, on the high shelf beside the chimney, where she could reach them. And he couldn't. She'd also gone through his saddlebags. This was not something she felt she needed to apologize for. The bags had been draped across the saddle of his horse, which had found its own way to the lean-to out back sometime during the night. Smart animal. She'd fed it and come back inside and set the bags on the table and gone through every pocket and pouch and fold with the same methodical attention she'd once given to Elias's private correspondence. What she found: a money clip holding $63 and a receipt from a hotel in Billings dated 11 days ago. A folded map of Montana with 3 locations circled in pencil, one of which was close enough to her cabin to make her stomach go cold. A spare box of 45 cartridges, a tin of tobacco, a stub of pencil, a battered journal with the first several pages torn out deliberately by the look of the rough edges, and at the bottom of the right-hand bag, wrapped in an oilskin cloth and tucked beneath a clean shirt, a Pinkerton detective badge, tarnished, old. The pin on the back was bent. She held it in her palm for a long moment. Then she unfolded the oilskin further and found the second thing, a charcoal sketch on heavy paper, portrait-sized, a woman's face, rendered in careful detail the high cheekbones, the particular set of the eyes, the way the hair came up at the temples, her face. Clara set it down on the table and took a step back. Her heart was going fast. She breathed through it deliberately, the way she'd trained herself to do, because panic had never once solved a problem, and she needed her mind clear. She looked at the man tied to her bed. He was awake. She hadn't heard him surface. He was watching her from under half-closed lids, and there was something careful in the stillness of him, a man conserving what little strength he had and paying close attention. with what remained. That yours, she said. She held up the sketch. A pause, yes. And that the badge. Another pause. Used to be. Clara pulled the chair away from the table and turned it around and sat on it backwards, arms folded across the top rail. She looked at him steadily. You have about 10 minutes of lucidity before that wound starts burning again and takes you back under, she said. So I'd suggest you talk fast and tell me the truth, because I have your guns and I have your horse, and I am the only person within 8 miles of here. Whatever leverage you think you have in this room, you don't. Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of a smile. My name is Silas Thorne, he said. His voice was rough, dry. She poured water from the pitcher and held the cup for him, and he drank without lowering his eyes from hers. I was a Pinkerton agent for 6 years out of the Chicago office. Left 2 years ago under circumstances I won't go into right now. Why not? Because it'd take more than 10 minutes, and you asked me to be efficient. Fair enough. She waited. 3 months ago, I took a private contract, he said. Skip trace and recovery. The client was a man named Elias Sterling. He wanted his wife found and returned to him. He stopped. His word was returned. Like you were a piece of freight. Clara's expression didn't change. She'd had a long time to get used to the way Elias talked about her. You found me, she said. I found your trail. I hadn't confirmed the location yet. His jaw tightened. But I'd gotten close enough to Sterling to understand what kind of man he was. I've tracked fugitives. I've tracked killers. I've tracked men who burned down houses with people inside them for the insurance money. He looked at her directly. Sterling isn't at the bottom of that list. The fire crackled. Wind pushed at the window. He hired other men too, Silas said. Cheaper ones. The ones who don't ask what happens to the woman after she's found. When I figured that out, I went back to Sterling and told him the contract was dissolved. He didn't take that well. He shifted slightly against the restraints and went still again at the effort. The men who shot me work for him. I've been 3 days ahead of them. And you came here. My horse made the decision. I was barely conscious. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was cataloging everything, the steadiness of his voice, the details that matched and the ones that didn't, the way his eyes stayed on hers instead of sliding to the exits. She'd learned to read people the hard way. Elias had taught her that too, though not intentionally. Why did you draw my portrait? She said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Sterling gave me a photograph. I redrew it. I do that with every case. It helps me remember a face as a person instead of a target. Sounds like a small thing. It isn't, she said. She stood up. She moved to the shelf and looked at the badge again without picking it up. What the Pinkertons did to the labor unions, she said. What they did to the railroad workers who went on strike. What they did to black communities when management paid them to go in. She turned around. You were part of that. He didn't flinch. Yes, and you left when I understood what I was part of. Yes, that doesn't erase it. No, she said. It doesn't. She sat back down. Outside, the storm was thinning, the howl dropping to a moan. By afternoon, the snow would settle, and anyone tracking through it would have clear prints to follow. Elias's men, she said. How many? 4 that I know of. Could be more. How far back? 2 days when I lost them. Less now with the storm clearing. She nodded slowly. Her mind was already moving routes, timelines, supplies. She'd been running the calculations since she left Chicago, and she'd learned to trust them. I'm going to untie one of your hands, she said, so you can drink and eat without me standing over you. The other one stays until I decide what to do with you. That's reasonable, he said. I know it is. She stood up and reached for the knot. I don't need your agreement, Mr. Thorne. I'm telling you what's happening, not asking. The almost smile came back, clearer this time. Yes, ma'am, he said. She untied the left hand. She kept the right secured to the frame. She put water and a piece of dried bread on the nightstand where he could reach them and went back to the table and picked up her pen and went back to work. He watched her for a while. Then he ate the bread slowly and drank the water and closed his eyes. She wrote until midday when she finally looked up. His breathing had evened out into sleep again, and the sketch of her face was still on the table. And outside the blizzard, had gone quiet. She looked at the portrait for a long time. A person, he'd said, not a target. She folded it carefully and set it aside and didn't throw it in the fire, which she thought about and decided against, and didn't fully examine why. He ran a fever for 2 days. Clara handled it the way she handled most things, with focus and without sentiment. She kept the wound clean. She changed the dressing morning and night. She made broth from dried venison and held the cup when he couldn't hold it himself. When the fever spiked on the second night, and he went delirious, speaking to people who weren't in the room, she wrung out cold cloths and pressed them to his forehead and neck and waited. He didn't die. By the third morning, the fever broke. He woke up clear-eyed and asked for real food, which she took as a sign of recovery. She untied his other hand. She did it without announcing it as a gesture or a turning point. She simply undid the knot, coiled the rope, and set it on the shelf. He rubbed his wrist and watched her and didn't say thank you, which she respected. Gratitude right now would have felt like theater. They both knew the situation hadn't changed. He was still too weak to be a threat, and she was still the one with the guns, so there was nothing meaningful yet to be grateful for. What they had instead was proximity, enforced, unavoidable, slightly awkward proximity. The cabin was 16 by 14 feet. She'd measured it on her second day here, counting floorboards. There was the bed, the table, 2 chairs, the fireplace, and a small partition she'd strung up from a rope and a wool blanket in the corner that served as the closest thing to privacy the space allowed. Silas, once mobile, turned out to be a man who understood how to take up less room than his actual size suggested. He stayed on his half of the cabin. He didn't hover. When he needed something, he asked for it plainly and without performance. When she needed quiet, he seemed to sense it and kept his mouth shut. After 4 days of close quarters, with a man she'd taken captive at gunpoint, Clara realized she wasn't afraid of him. That itself was worth paying attention to. She'd spent 4 years afraid of Elias Sterling in their house on Lakeshore Drive. 4 years of measuring her words and watching his hands and calculating the distance to every door. Fear had become so ordinary. She'd stopped registering it the way you stop registering the sound of a clock on the wall. You only notice when it stops. It had stopped. She didn't know what to do with the silence where the fear used to be. On the 5th day, Silas managed to walk to the table and sit down without her help. He ate a full meal. He looked better, still pale under his tan, still moving carefully, but the worst of it was behind him. Clara knew they'd need to discuss what came next. The men who shot him wouldn't stay 2 days back forever. The ledger had a deadline. The world outside this cabin didn't care that they needed more time. But that conversation happened in the afternoon. What happened in the morning was something else. Silas had gone outside at first light to see to his horse and assess the snow levels. Clara had the cabin to herself for the first time in 5 days, and she used it. She went to her pack, which she kept at the foot of the bed, and took out the small tin of salve Ruth had pressed into her hands before she'd left the trading post 2 weeks ago. Ruth had made it herself yarrow and calendula and something else she hadn't named. For when the cold makes the old hurts ache, Ruth had said, and she'd held Clara's gaze just long enough for Clara to know she meant more than the weather. Clara took off her shawl. She reached back and worked the top buttons of her dress loose, just far enough to get to the upper part of her back, and she opened the tin and tried to get the salve where it needed to go. The problem was the angle. It was always the angle. The worst of the scarring ran in diagonal lines from her left shoulder blade down toward the center of her spine, and getting her right hand there required a contortion that pulled at the healing skin and made her eyes water. She worked at it slowly, breathing through it. The salve was cool, and it helped, and she focused on that. She heard the door. She heard the specific sound of a man's boot on the threshold, one boot, then a pause, then nothing. She knew immediately that he'd seen her before he'd had the chance to not see her. She yanked her dress back up. The tin hit the floor. It rolled. She scrambled after it, and her hands were shaking, and she pulled her shawl around her shoulders and pressed herself into the corner beside the partition. And she was breathing too fast. And she knew she was breathing too fast, and she could not make it stop. Silas stood just inside the door. He hadn't moved further into the room. His coat was still on, snow on his shoulders. The silence was enormous. A tin cup was sitting on the edge of the table. He moved, she flinched. She couldn't help it, and his elbow caught the cup, and it hit the floor with a clang that went through her like a gunshot. The sound that came out of her wasn't words. It was something older than words, pain and shame, and the particular horror of being seen in the one way she had never wanted to be seen. She curled into herself in the corner. She pulled the shawl tighter. Her face was hot, and her throat was closed, and she couldn't look at him. "Please don't look," she said. Her voice broke in the middle of it. "Please." She heard him stop moving entirely. Silence. Long enough that she started to be aware of the fire, and the wind outside, and her own heartbeat. Then she heard the specific sound of a coat coming off. Slow, deliberate. He crossed the room, not to her. He stopped at the foot of the bed. She could see his boots at the edge of her vision, and he reached forward and laid the coat gently over her shoulders, over the shawl, and stepped back. Not one step, 2 full steps, putting the length of the rug between them. He sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor, against the far wall, where she could see all of him from the corner, without having to look up or track his movements. She heard him exhale. "I served with a man in the Pinkerton," he said. His voice was quiet and even, not soft the way people get soft when they pity you, which she hated, just level, like he was talking about the weather or the condition of the road. Good operative, better than most. His name was James. A pause. He'd been in the war, came back with most of himself, but not quite all of it. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone. Got it at Chancellorsville. Another pause. He wore his collar up for 2 years after he got back. Couldn't stand for people to ask about it. Couldn't stand the look they got. Clara was listening. She hadn't meant to be, but she was. "One day I asked him why it bothered him," Silas said. "Not the scar. The looking," he said. "The looking makes it theirs. Makes it something they get to react to. Something they get to decide how to feel about." He said he didn't want anyone else deciding what that scar meant. Clara's breathing had slowed. She hadn't noticed when. "I understand that," Silas said. "What you carry belongs to you, every part of it, and nobody gets to look unless you say so." He was quiet for a moment. "The only disgusting thing in this room is the man who gave you those marks, not the woman who survived them." He paused. "Until you tell me otherwise. I'm staying on this side of the room. That's not going to change." She didn't say anything. He didn't seem to need her to. After a while, she reached down and picked up the tin of salve that had rolled near the edge of the partition. She turned it in her hands. "The angle is difficult," she said. Her voice was rough. "To reach." A pause. "I can help," he said carefully, "if you want. Or I can tell you to ask Ruth next time you're at the trading post. Either one." She thought about it for a long time, longer than she normally let herself sit with a decision. "Tell me about James," she said finally. "Keep talking." "All right," he said, and he did. He talked about James and the war and the years after, and his voice stayed level and calm. And Clara turned slightly toward the wall and worked the buttons of her dress again, and her hands didn't shake this time. He didn't look. She knew, without being able to explain how she knew, that he didn't look. When she was done, she buttoned up and pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and sat for a while in the corner. The fire had burned down a little. Outside, a bird called once and went quiet. "I'm going to need your help," she said. "Not about the salve, about everything else, the ledger, the men who were coming, the deadline, all of it." "I know," he said. "That doesn't mean I trust you." "I know that too." She looked at him directly for the first time since the door. He was sitting with his back against the wall, and his long legs stretched out in front of him, and his expression was open and uncomplicated. "But you're going to earn it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am." She got up from the corner. She crossed to the table and set the tin of salve beside her pen and her ink and the pages she'd been copying. She sat down in the chair. She pushed the second chair out from the table with her foot. An invitation. Small, deliberate. Silas got up off the floor, moving slowly, favoring his left side. He came to the table and sat down in the chair she'd offered, and they got to work. Ruth's trading post sat at the end of a two-track road that the county didn't bother to name and the map didn't bother to show. That was by design. The building itself looked like it might fall down if you spoke too loudly near it. A long, low structure of weathered logs with a covered porch running the full front length and a chimney that always had smoke coming out of it, winter or summer, night or day. There were two hitching posts and a watering trough out front, and the trough was never frozen because Ruth chopped the ice herself every morning before first light. There were bundles of dried herbs hanging from the porch eaves. There was a rocking chair with a wool blanket folded over the arm, and sitting in that chair, most hours of most days, was Ruth herself, with a short-barreled shotgun across her knees, and an expression that made clear she already knew exactly what you needed and was deciding whether you'd earned it. She was a tall woman, dark-skinned, somewhere between 50 and 60 years old, with silver threads through her hair and hands that showed the history of every hard thing she'd done with them. She'd been born enslaved in Virginia. She'd walked north in the winter of 1863 with a baby on her back and nothing else. She'd outlasted two husbands, a prairie fire, and a tax dispute with the county that she'd won in court herself after teaching herself the relevant statutes. She ran the trading post alone and answered to no one, and extended or withheld her help based on her own judgment, which was considerable. She'd met Clara 3 weeks ago, when Clara had arrived half-frozen and alone and had offered to pay full price for a sack of flour and a box of matches. Ruth had looked at her for about 10 seconds and then said, "You can have those. Come inside first." And that was that. Now Clara arrived with a man. Ruth looked at Silas from the rocking chair. Silas looked back at Ruth. Clara stood slightly to the side and said nothing, which was the right choice. "You Thorne?" Ruth said. Silas blinked. "Yes. James Whitfield served under you in the 42nd Chicago Bureau. He's my brother-in-law's cousin." She tilted her head. "He says you kept his case records clean when the superintendent wanted to bury a false conviction. Says you did it at some risk to yourself." Silas said nothing. "He also says you've got a temper and you hold a grudge and you make terrible coffee. 2 of those are true," Silas said. Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was related to one. She set the shotgun aside and stood up. "Come in then, both of you. I've got a pot on." The inside of the trading post was warm and densely packed. Shelves of dry goods, bundles of trapping supplies, a glass case of medicines and tinctures, maps, rope, a rack of second-hand coats and boots sorted by size. There was a counter at the back with a wood stove behind it, and on the stove was a pot of coffee that smelled like it meant business. Ruth poured 3 cups and listened while Clara talked. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react visibly when Clara described the ledger or the land theft or Elias's methods. She just listened with the complete, settled attention of a woman who had heard many serious things in her life and knew that the appropriate response to serious things was to hear them fully before you spoke. When Clara finished, Ruth said, "The Pony Express drop box in Chicago. You're certain it got there?" "I have the receipt." Ruth nodded slowly. "I have people in Chicago. I can get word to them about the pickup when the time comes." She turned her cup in her hands. "The gala is 6 weeks out. That's tight." "I know," Clara said. "We'll need a plan for getting you into the city that doesn't go through Sterling's people." Ruth looked at Silas. "That part's yours, I expect." "Working on it," he said. "Work faster." She stood up and refilled the cups. "In the meantime, you need to know how to use what you've got." She looked at Clara. Not just the ledger. All of it. Which was how. An hour later, Clara found herself standing in the flat, snow-crusted field behind the trading post with a Colt revolver in her hand, and Silas Thorne 3 feet to her left. He'd set up 6 tin cans on a split-rail fence 40 feet out. "Have you fired a handgun before?" he asked. "I fired a rifle at you." "Different animal." He didn't reach for her hands or her arms or adjust her stance by touching her. He stood where he was and talked. The revolver is lighter, but it'll move on you more. The trick is grip, not muscle. Hold it like you're firm, but not angry. You white-knuckle the grip. It'll throw your aim every time. She adjusted her hands. He watched. Feet shoulder width, your dominant foot back. Just slightly. Don't square up to the target. That's a bigger silhouette. Quarter turn. She shifted. Now line up the rear sight with the front sight and put the front sight on the can. Don't look at the can. Look at the sight. The can'll be blurry. That's right. She fired. The shot went wide. The recoil surprised her, and she dropped the muzzle. She reset. Fired again. Wide again. But less so. She fired 4 more times. On the 5th shot, the second can from the left spun off the fence. She lowered the gun. You flinched on the first 4, Silas said. Common. Your brain knows the noise is coming, and it tries to get ahead of it. You have to learn to let the shot surprise you. Line up, hold the sight, and squeeze until it fires. Don't anticipate. How do you stop anticipating something you know is going to happen? Practice, he said simply. Same way you stop flinching at anything else. You do it enough times until your brain gets bored of being afraid. She reloaded. He watched her do it. She'd learned that part from reading, and didn't comment on her technique until she asked. She asked. He corrected 3 small things. She reloaded again and raised the gun. Something I want you to understand, Silas said. He wasn't lecturing. His voice was the same level. Straightforward tone he used for everything. A gun doesn't care if the person holding it is a man or a woman. It doesn't care what society says about who should be standing here. It only cares about physics, the mechanics of how it's held and where it's pointed. He paused. What I'm teaching you isn't a favor. It's not something I'm giving you. It's something you have a right to. Every person has the right to defend their own life. That right doesn't diminish based on your sex or your station or what your husband thinks about it. Clara kept her eyes on the sight. Elias took a lot from you, Silas said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the one thing he couldn't take is the fact that you're here, standing up, loading a weapon, planning your own future. A pause. Nobody gave you that. You kept it yourself. She fired. The can flew off the fence. She shot the next 4 without stopping, working down the fence line, and hit 3 of them clean. The 4th she grazed, and it spun but stayed. She reloaded and took it off on the next shot. She lowered the gun. Silas said nothing, which was the right thing to say. She turned and walked back toward the trading post, and after a moment he followed. And they didn't talk about what he'd said or what it had meant, because they both understood it already, and saying more would have made it smaller. Ruth was on the porch with her coffee. When they came back around the corner, she looked at the fence, counted the cans on the ground, looked at Clara. Good, she said. Inside, they spread a map on the counter and started talking routes. Ruth knew which mountain passes were clear and which were being watched. She knew a man who ran freight wagons into Chicago who asked no questions. She knew a woman in the city who could get them proper clothes for a society gala and wouldn't talk about who she'd gotten them for. The gala is at the Palmer House, Clara said. Elias uses it every winter. The federal judge that usually attends is a man named Hargrove. He's been trying to build a land fraud case for 2 years. He just hasn't had the evidence. He'll have it now, Ruth said. Only if we can get the ledger out of the drop box and into his hands before Elias realizes what's happening. Ruth nodded. My contact in Chicago, his name is Thomas. He's solid. He'll retrieve the ledger when you send word. She looked up. But you'll need to be there in person. Hargrove won't move on an anonymous package. He needs a witness. He needs you. Clara had known this. She'd known it from the beginning. The ledger proved what Elias had done. But she was the one who had lived inside his operation. She was the one who could explain it, page by page, and stand in front of a judge and say what she'd seen. This had always been a plan that ended with her walking into a room full of Elias Sterling's allies and looking him in the face. She'd made her peace with it, mostly. Then we go to Chicago, she said. Ruth looked at Silas. You know what you're walking into, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. I've been in worse rooms, he said. Ruth considered that. Then she looked at Clara with the same frank, level gaze she used on everything. And you? What do you know about what you're walking into? Clara thought about the cabin she'd left, the train she'd ridden, the blizzard she'd survived. She thought about the corner of the room, and the coat across her shoulders, and the tin cans spinning off the fence. She thought about the ledger sitting in a box in Chicago, packed with the names of people Elias had robbed and ruined, people who had never gotten to sit at a table and plan their own futures. I know everything, she said. That's why we're going. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee. All right then, she said. Let's plan. The men came on a Tuesday. Clara knew they were coming about 20 minutes before they arrived. Silas's horse told her. The animal had been calm all morning, eating steadily from the hay she'd put out. And then suddenly it wasn't calm anymore. It moved to the back corner of the lean-to and stood there with its ears flat and its nostrils wide, staring at the tree line to the east. Clara had been watching from the window. She went inside and told Silas without raising her voice. He was on his feet in under 10 seconds. They'd talked about this, not once, but several times, in the practical, unsentimental way they'd developed for discussing unpleasant possibilities. Silas had drawn a rough layout of the property in the dirt outside and walked her through the angles where a shooter would position himself, which walls offered real cover and which only looked like they did, where the blind spots were. Clara had memorized it, the way she'd memorized the ledger entries, the way she'd memorized the floor plan of Elias's Chicago mansion. Information was the one resource that didn't run out. Silas took his revolver off the shelf. Clara took the rifle. 2 positions, he said quietly. You stay low at the window. Left side, not center puts you in direct line if they breach the door. Shoot at movement, not noise. I know, she said. I know you know. He moved to the right side of the door and stood against the wall. Clara went to the window and crouched below the sill. Outside, the snow was brilliant white under a flat gray sky, and the tree line was still. And for about 2 minutes, there was nothing. Then there were 4 men on horseback at the edge of the tree line. They stopped there, looking. One of them pointed at the cabin. 4, Clara said quietly. I see them. They didn't come in fast and loud. That would have been easier to read. They came in careful spreading wide. 2 angling left toward the lean-to. 2 coming straight toward the cabin door, and the carefulness of it was its own kind of alarm. These weren't ranch hands. These were men who did this for a living. The first shot came through the window. Clara had already moved back from the glass when she saw the man raise his arm. The bullet went through the upper pane and buried itself in the far wall and showered her with splinters. She pressed flat to the floor, got back to the low edge of the sill, and fired once at the man who'd shot. He went sideways off his horse, and the horse bolted. The next 2 minutes were very loud. Silas kicked the door open and fired twice from the threshold and pulled back before they could return fire. Clara worked from the window, pick a target, acquire the sight, squeeze, move. She hit one more man in the shoulder. He didn't go down, but he pulled back behind the lean-to, and she didn't see him again for a while. The remaining 2 outside retreated beyond the rifle's reliable range and stopped shooting, which meant they were thinking. That was worse. Silas came back from the door and crouched beside her. His expression was calm in the particular way that people are calm when they're pulling their focus down to a single point. They're not breaching, he said. No, they know we're dug in. They'll try to wait us out or... He stopped. She smelled it at the same moment. Smoke, not wood smoke from the fireplace. This was sharper, rawer coming from outside and low from the base of the east wall, where the chinking was thin and the logs sat close to the ground. She turned, and she could already see it seeping under the baseboard, gray and thin but gaining. They lit the wall, she said. Back door, Silas said immediately. There is no back door. His jaw set. He turned and looked at the room, the one door, the one window, the fireplace that vented through the roof, the walls that were now burning, on the outside from at least one point. He looked at the window. It's small, Clara said. You'll fit. I'll fit too. He crossed to the window and looked at the angle, the broken pane, the size of the frame, the distance to the ground. He grabbed the wooden chair and swung it hard into the remaining glass. It cleared the frame. He kicked out the lower crossbar of the window casing to widen the gap. The smoke was thicker now, coming up through the floorboards. The east wall was catching from outside, and once the interior logs caught it, would go fast. Go, he said. If there's someone outside waiting, I'll be right behind you. Go. She went through head first with the rifle, got her shoulders through, caught herself on her hands on the ground outside, pulled her legs through, and came up moving. She went left, away from the direction the men had come from, pressed herself against the outer wall, and scanned. The man she'd hit in the shoulder was around the corner of the lean-to, partially hidden behind the structure. He saw her at the same time she saw him and raised his gun. The shot from inside hit the lean-to wall 6 inches from his head. Silas, firing through the window before he came through. The man ducked. Clara ran. She made it to the woodpile stacked along the north side and crouched behind it and got the rifle up. She could see 2 of the remaining men from here, one near the horses, one moving along the far tree line. She tracked the closer one. Fired. He went down. Behind her, she heard the sound of a man coming through a window. She started to turn. The crash came from inside. Enormous. A sound like something structural had let go a beam. A rafter. Something load-bearing that had been holding everything else up. It was followed immediately by a wave of orange light that she saw reflected off the snow, and then a rush of heat that she felt on the back of her neck from 15 feet away. She turned around. The roof was going. Silas. She was on her feet before she'd decided to be, running toward the cabin. The east wall was fully involved now, flames climbing the outside logs and sheets, and there was an opening where the window had been, but it was lit around the edges, and she couldn't see. She got to the window frame, and heat hit her like a wall. The beam had come down across the middle of the room. She could see it through the smoke, a full structural timber, burning, lying diagonal across the floor from the fireplace to the far wall. The far wall, where she'd last heard Silas moving. Silas, a sound came back. Not words, something. She grabbed the window frame. She was going in. That was simply what she was going to do. And she already had one leg through the frame when something hit her from behind hard, at the base of her skull, and the light went completely out. She didn't feel herself fall. The next thing she knew was motion. She was horizontal, moving, and her head was ringing like a struck bell. She was face down across a horse, her wrists lashed together and hooked over the saddle horn, and her face was inches from the ground rolling past below. She tried to push up. Her arms didn't work right. The smell of smoke was fading behind her. The sound of the fire was fading. The sound of men's voices were closer, one of them directly behind her on the horse, one further out, talking short sentences she couldn't parse through the ringing in her head. She turned her face sideways and caught a cold mouthful of winter air and let it clear her some. She thought about the rifle. Gone. She thought about the revolver she'd tucked into her coat pocket during the fight. She shifted her weight carefully, as little as possible. Her right hand was still inside her coat sleeve. She could feel the shape of it against her hip. She thought about Silas. The beam had come down where he'd been standing. She closed her eyes against the cold and the motion and the pain at the base of her skull. She made herself breathe evenly. She made herself think about what came next instead of what she'd left behind, because what she'd left behind was on fire and out of reach, and falling apart right now would not help Silas, and it would not help her, and it would not help a single person whose name was in that ledger. She would not fall apart, but she kept her eyes closed for a long time, and she held the shape of him in her mind, the boots on the floor, the level voice, the coat across her shoulders in the dark, and she did not let go of it. She didn't let herself let go of it at all. The fire gave way to strings. Clara came back to full consciousness in stages. And the first thing she was fully aware of, before she opened her eyes, was music. A string quartet somewhere below her, playing something she recognized from the conservatory concerts Elias had dragged her to in the early years of their marriage. when he'd still been performing the role of devoted husband for his business associates. She was in a real bed, with a feather mattress and pressed linen sheets and 3 blankets layered precisely. And the ceiling above her was 14 feet high and painted pale ivory, with gilt molding at the corners. She was in Chicago. She lay still and took full inventory before she moved a single muscle. Her wrists were unbound. Her head still ached from the blow, but the sharp edge was gone. She'd been unconscious long enough for the worst of it to pass. She was wearing a nightgown she didn't recognize. Someone had changed her clothes while she was out. She kept her breathing even, and her eyes open just enough to see. The room was one she recognized. It was the blue guest room in Elias Sterling's Lakeshore Drive mansion. 3rd floor, northeast corner. She'd put guests in here herself. Once she knew the layout without having to look wardrobe to the left. Writing desk under the window. Door to the hall on the right. No connecting room. No other exit. The window was pale gray. Early morning or overcast afternoon. She couldn't tell which. She sat up slowly. There was a tray on the writing desk. Tea, toast. A small dish of preserves. On the chair beside the bed. Her clothes, clean clothes. Not the ones she'd been wearing, but clothes she recognized from her own wardrobe. Elias had clearly made arrangements before he'd sent his men to Montana. He'd been that certain they'd bring her back. The door opened. Elias Sterling was 51 years old and looked 45, which he'd accomplished through rigorous attention to appearance, a great deal of money, and the energizing effect of having won at nearly everything he'd ever attempted. He was tall and lean, silver at the temples, dressed in a charcoal morning suit with a white pocket square. His face was the face of a man accustomed to being looked at composed, pleasant, arranged. She'd learned to read beneath it, had spent years learning. Under the pleasantness was something that moved like water over bedrock, always flowing, always finding the lowest point, always patient. He came into the room and closed the door behind him. Clara, his voice was warm. It was always warm. "I'm glad you're safe." She didn't say anything. He moved to the chair beside the desk and sat down, crossing his legs, entirely at ease. He'd always been better at silence than most people. He used it the way some men used a raised fist to make you uncomfortable enough to fill it. She was not going to fill it. He tried the warmth again. "I was worried when I heard you'd been out in those conditions, a blizzard, alone in a mining cabin of all places." He shook his head. "Whatever drove you to that? Clara, I want you to know I take responsibility. Our marriage has had its difficulties. I haven't always been as attentive as I should have been." She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze. "But you're home now, and we can discuss all of it, calmly. And how long was I unconscious?" She said. A small pause. "A little over 3 days. 3 days." She recalibrated. 3 days of travel from Montana, plus the time before that. She checked the deadline in her head, the gala, the ledger, the drop box. She had time. Not a lot of it, but she had it. "I'd like some tea," she said. He poured it for her. He brought it to the bedside table himself, which he hadn't done in their marriage since 1879. She picked it up and drank it, and felt the warmth go down and stayed quiet. He watched her. She watched him watch her. This was a thing they'd always done, this measuring, this surface-level reading of the other. The difference was that he'd always believed he was better at it. He had no evidence for that belief. He'd simply never been challenged on it. "I know about the ledger," he said. She kept her face neutral. "What ledger?" His expression shifted very slightly. "Clara, I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. The account book you took from my office before you left. The one with the land transaction records." He uncrossed his legs. "I'd like you to tell me where it is. I don't have it. I'm not asking if you have it. I'm asking where it is." She set the teacup down carefully. "I don't know what you're talking about. Elias, I left because I was frightened. I had no plan. I've been living in a mining cabin for a month." She let a small, careful crack show in her voice, not too much. Just a hairline fracture, the kind that looked like honesty. "I thought your men were going to kill me." He studied her. She had spent 4 years studying him. She knew every instrument in his arsenal. She knew the warmth and the silence and the long, thoughtful pause before the pivot. She knew the voice he used when he'd already decided what was true and was simply conducting the conversation to confirm it. She knew the look he got when he was about to change tactics. She saw it now. "I had a doctor examine you while you were unconscious," he said. His tone was still level. "Given your mental state when you left the erratic behavior, the paranoid ideation," he paused. "Dr. Harmon's assessment is that you've been suffering from a nervous collapse brought on by overwork and an overwrought temperament." Another pause. "The papers are already drawn up, Clara. One signature from me and Dr. Harmon, and you'd be transferred to the Illinois State Hospital for the insane by the end of the week." There it was. She'd been waiting for it. She'd actually rehearsed her response to it, sitting in the cabin in Montana, while Silas slept off his fever, and she'd stared at the ceiling and thought through every card Elias was likely to play. She'd ranked them by probability. This one had been at the top of the list. Women had been committed to institutions on less, on the word of a husband and a cooperative physician, on the argument of emotional instability, of nervous temperament, of an inability to manage herself. It had happened to women she'd met at society functions, women who'd contradicted their husbands publicly, women who'd tried to control their own property, women who'd said no to one thing too many. They disappeared, and people said what a tragedy and moved on. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You'd do that." "I would prefer not to," Elias said. "I would prefer you simply told me where the ledger is. Came back to your place in this household, and let us put this unpleasantness behind us." "My place," she said. "Clara, you want me to come back to my place?" She let that sit. "Is that what you said to the Nakota families before you forged the signatures on their land titles, that they should know their place?" The warmth disappeared, just for a second, like a lamp flame in a draft. Then it was back. But she'd seen behind it. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He stood up. He moved to the window and looked out at the gray winter street below. There were horses and carriages, and men in good coats walking quickly in the cold. From up here it looked orderly. It looked like a world that made sense. "The gala is in 8 days," he said, with his back to her. "I'd like you there. It would look better for both of us if you were there." "Of course," she said. He turned, looked at her. "And the ledger," he said. "I told you," she said pleasantly. "I don't know what you mean." He held her gaze for a long, flat moment. Then he moved to the door, his hand on the knob. He stopped without turning around. "You should know the house is staffed around the clock," he said. "The staff have their instructions. And Dr. Harmon makes a house call every other day." "How thoughtful," she said. He left. Clara sat in the bed with the tea cooling in her hands and counted to 60 in her head. Then she got up, pulled on the clean dress laid over the chair, and went to the window. The street was 3 floors below. Elias had chosen this room deliberately, high enough to discourage exits. She knew there was a key in the lock, and she knew it would be turned from the outside. She wasn't planning to leave through the door. What she was planning needed 8 days. She had 8 days, and she had information. Elias didn't know she had Ruth's contacts in the city, Thomas's name and location, the underground network that had been quietly carrying messages and people and evidence for longer than Elias Sterling had been a problem. She had something else, too. She went to the writing desk and pulled open the small right-hand drawer. It was full of correspondence house accounts, invitation lists, things Elias left in guest rooms because he assumed his guests were not reading them. She sorted through carefully, touching nothing she didn't need to, reading quickly. 3 names she recognized from the ledger, attending the gala. A letter from a land company in Helena confirming a transaction that had finalized 2 weeks ago. Land that had been stolen from black homesteaders by a forged federal patent in 1881. She knew the names. They were in the ledger. Her hands were steady. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it, closed the drawer, and sat down in the chair by the window. She watched the street below. She watched the light change. As the afternoon moved toward evening and the string quartet downstairs ran through its rehearsal again, she began to plan. She counted the household staff she remembered and cross-referenced against who Elias would trust with real information. Not many, probably 2 or 3. She worked out the timing for getting a message out. She thought about what Ruth's contact, Thomas, would need to know, and how to get it to him, and through what channel. The loneliness was there. She didn't ignore it. There was something that sat in her chest like a stone when she thought about what she'd left behind the fire. The burning roof. The sound that had come back when she'd called his name. She'd deal with the stone later. Right now, she had work to do. She picked up the pen from the writing desk and pulled a piece of house stationery from the stack and began writing. Not a message, a list. Everything she remembered about the gala, the venue, the layout, Elias's usual security arrangements, which judges and officials typically attended, and where they stationed themselves. She wrote until the room went dark. Then she put the list inside the lining of the dress she'd arrived in, which was draped over the wardrobe, and which the staff had not yet taken away. And she went back to bed, and she stared at the ivory ceiling in the dark, and she thought about Montana. She thought about a coat dropped over her shoulders, and 2 steps back, and a level voice that did not pity her. She held on to that. 8 days. He didn't die. That was the first thing Silas established when he came back to consciousness, because it seemed like important information, and he hadn't been certain of it for a while. He was outside. That was the second thing. He could feel snow under his left cheek and cold air on his face, which meant he was no longer inside a burning building, which was an improvement over his last clear memory. He was lying on his side. Some distance from the cabin, he could see the orange glow of it from here, could hear it going, could feel the heat from 20 feet away, even in the winter cold. He tried to sit up. The left side of his body informed him, in very direct terms, that sitting up was not on the agenda right now. He lay back down and breathed carefully and did an inventory. His right hand and arm were functional. His right leg was functional. His left leg was functional, but the knee had taken something. A twist or a blow, hard to tell. His left side, from the ribs up to the shoulder, was a continuous region of pain so large and undifferentiated that he couldn't locate a source, just a vast burning that told him something very bad had happened there, and it hadn't finished happening yet. He remembered the beam. He'd been heading for the window. He'd heard Clara clear. The frame heard her hit the ground outside, heard her come up running, and he'd turned to follow her, and the beam had come down across his left side, and he'd gone sideways into the near wall, and then through it, or the wall had given way, or something had. He didn't have a clear account of the next few minutes. He had vague impressions of heat, and of moving by instinct, and of cold air hitting his face, and then very little else. He'd gotten himself out. He didn't know how. He lay still for a while and let the cold do what it could for the burning. It helped, marginally. He turned his head carefully and looked at the cabin. The roof was gone. The east and south walls were still going. The west wall had partially collapsed outward, which was probably how he'd gotten clear of the structure the wall had failed, and he'd gone with it. No men visible from his position. He could hear horses, distant, moving away. They'd gotten Clara. That was the only explanation. If she'd gotten clear and they hadn't taken her, she'd be here. She wasn't here. He lay with that for a moment. Just the weight of it, clear and direct. He let himself feel it fully for 30 seconds, because denying what was real had never helped him think clearly, and he needed to think clearly. Then he started working on the problem. He got to sitting in about 4 minutes. It cost him. He sat in the snow with his teeth clenched and his right hand pressed flat to the ground for balance and waited for the spinning to level out. When it did, he looked at his left side. The burn ran from his lower ribs up to the ball of his shoulder. His coat had protected him partially. The leather was scorched and in places had melted into what was underneath, but where the beam had actually contacted him. The coat wasn't there anymore, and the damage was significant. He didn't look too long. There wasn't anything useful to be learned from looking. He needed to get somewhere warm before the cold finished what the fire had started. He needed Ruth. Getting from his current location to Ruth's trading post was 20 miles on a good day. He didn't have a horse. He had one functioning arm, one damaged side, one slightly compromised knee, and a burning determination that he was fully aware was not a substitute for any of those things, but was going to have to do some of the work anyway. He found the horse 40 minutes later. One of Sterling's men had lost his horse in the fight, and the animal had drifted east, away from the fire and the noise, and was standing in a windbreak of pines, looking resentful and cold. Silas approached it slowly and talked to it without stopping low. Steady, nothing remarkable. Just a voice that said, "I'm not a threat, and I'm going to be very boring," and the horse eventually let him close enough to take the reins. Getting into the saddle one-armed with a damaged left side was something he managed to do exactly once and hoped never to do again. He pointed the horse west. He got to Ruth's just before noon the next day. She heard him coming and was on the porch before he made it to the hitching post. He saw her face when she got a good look at him, and whatever she'd been prepared to say, she didn't say it. She just came down the steps and took the horse's bridle and looked up at him. "They took her," he said. "I know." She kept her voice matter-of-fact. "A man came through last night. Rider heading east fast. I sent Thomas a wire this morning." He looked at her. "Thomas in Chicago," she said. "I told you about him. He'll find out what he can and keep watch." She tied the horse and came around to Silas's right side. "Come inside. You look like something I'd throw back." He didn't argue with that assessment. Inside, she cut away what remained of his coat and the shirt under it with a pair of shears, and looked at the burn in good light without saying anything for a long time. Then she went to her medicine shelf. "You're going to carry this scar," she said. "Nothing I can do about that. But I can keep it clean and keep infection out of it, which is the difference between a scar and a death." She started working. "This is going to be painful." "It already is. More. It was." He sat still and let her work, and thought about Clara. He thought about her in Chicago, in that house, with that man. He thought about what 4 years of that house had already cost her, and what she'd built back from nothing, and how clearly and exactly she'd thought through every piece of this problem before she'd trusted him with any of it. She wasn't helpless. He knew that. She was probably the least helpless person he'd ever met. Knowing it didn't make the chair any easier to sit in. "Stop," Ruth said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're doing with your face," she said. "Stop it." That expression doesn't help her. He made himself breathe out. "How long before I can travel?" A competent physician would say 6 weeks. "And what do you say?" Ruth looked at him over her shoulder. "I say, if you get on a train in 4 days and you keep it clean, and you don't do anything catastrophically stupid with the left arm, you'll make Chicago in 1 piece. 4 days. 4 days." She tied off the dressing with efficient hands. "The gala is in 10 days. That gives you 6 days in the city to find out where she is. Get yourself presentable enough to walk into the Palmer house without being immediately removed, and make contact." He sat with that timeline. It was tight. It was possible. "I don't exactly look like a society investor right now," he said. "No," Ruth agreed. "You look like a man who got set on fire. I need a story. You need a suit, a story, a name, and someone in that city who can vouch for you to get through the door." She came around and looked at him directly. "I have all 4 of those. The question is whether you can hold yourself together long enough to use them." He met her eyes. "I've been in worse rooms," he said. Clara said the same thing. She pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. "I know. That's why I'm helping you." She folded her hands in her lap. "Now, listen carefully, because I'm going to tell you how this is going to work, and I'm only going to say it once." He listened. She talked for an hour. The suit was being altered by a woman in Chicago named Mrs. Beaumont, who owed Ruth a debt of long standing and didn't ask questions. The name was Elias's own game, played against him, a gold mine investor named Fletcher, from a real mine in Nevada that Ruth's contact had connections to. The voucher was a letter of introduction from a senator who attended the gala every year and who had his own reasons to want Elias Sterling examined by a federal judge. Ruth had been building this quietly for months, before Clara arrived, before any of this began. She'd been pulling threads and waiting. Sterling stolen from a lot of people, Ruth said. The Nakota families, the black homesteaders in the Helena Valley, the freedmen who filed land patents in 76 and 77 and had them disappeared. She paused. I'm one of them. My sister's family filed a patent in 1877 on 40 acres north of Helena. The claim disappeared from the Federal Registry in 1880. I didn't have the proof of what happened to it until Clara walked through my door with that ledger number. Silas was quiet. So this isn't charity, Ruth said. And it isn't just about Clara, though I do it for Clara alone. She looked at him steadily. This is about the ledger getting into Hargrove's hands. That happens. A lot of people get some measure of what they're owed. She paused. Do you understand the full weight of what you're walking into? Yes, he said. Then carry it right. He nodded once. He spent 4 days at the trading post. Ruth changed the dressing morning and evening. She fed him and made him sleep, and made him walk a little further each day so the stiffness in his knee worked out and the left side learned its new limits. She was not gentle about any of this. She was efficient and direct, and he respected her for it. On the 3rd day, she gave him a small mirror and let him see the burn for the first time. He looked at it for a long moment. It ran from just below his ribs up over the ridge of his shoulder blade. The skin there was changed, permanently tightened in some places, raised in others. A different texture from what had been there before. It was a significant scar. It was going to be a significant scar for the rest of his life. He handed the mirror back. A man I knew once told me that other people don't get to decide what a scar means, he said. He was talking about war. It applies. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she set the mirror aside and went back to the dressing. On the morning of the 4th day, she brought out the suit. It was dark navy. Well cut, nothing flashy, but nothing cheap. A white shirt. A watch chain that was real gold and had belonged to Ruth's second husband, who, she said, would have approved of the use. A hat that was new enough to look Eastern without looking ostentatious. Silas put it on carefully, minding the left side. He looked in the long mirror Ruth kept behind the wardrobe door. The man looking back at him was not a bounty hunter, or an ex-Pinkerton, or a man who'd crawled out of a burning cabin in the Montana snow. He was a gentleman from Nevada with mining interests and a letter of introduction, and no reason anyone should look twice at him. He practiced the story until it came out without pauses. Ruth walked him to the door of the trading post when the freight wagon came to pick him up. She handed him an envelope, the letter from the senator. The name of Mrs. Beaumont, Thomas's address in the city. You get in, you find her, you make the contact. In that order, yes. Don't let her see you're worried. He looked at her. She's been holding herself together for 10 days in that house, Ruth said. She doesn't need your worry. She needs you to walk in that room like it's all going according to plan. He thought about that. He thought about a woman who'd tied a stranger to a bed frame and saved his life and learned to shoot in the snow and crossed half of Montana on her own because she'd decided to. It is going according to plan, he said. Her plan. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Don't mess it up, she said. He stepped up onto the wagon. The freight road turned east toward the rail line, and the trading post disappeared behind the pines, and the winter sun was flat and bright and cold. And Silas Thorne sat in the bed of the wagon with a scar on his side and a story in his pocket, and 800 miles between him and Clara Vance. He watched the road unfold ahead of him and thought about what came next. The city, the gala, the ballroom full of people who moved money, the way water moved, carrying everything away from the people who'd made it and depositing it somewhere else. He'd been in that world before, briefly, at the edge of it. He'd seen what it protected and what it discarded. He was going back in. And this time he wasn't working for anyone in it. The Palmer house was lit like a fever dream. Crystal chandeliers hung in tiers from the ballroom ceiling, throwing light in every direction off the mirrors, off the women's jewelry, off the champagne glasses moving through the crowd on silver trays. The floor was white marble. The drapes were gold. The string quartet in the corner played something Viennese and precise. And around it all moved 200 of Chicago's most powerful people in their finest clothes, talking about nothing with the confident fluency of those who had never needed to talk about anything real. Clara stood near the east wall in a blood-red silk gown she'd found in her wardrobe, Elias's choice. She was certain, selected to make her visible, to mark her as present and returned and accounted for, and watched the room with the attention of someone reading a map. She'd been here 40 minutes. Elias had arrived with her on his arm, performing warmth and domesticity for the assembled guests. And she had performed the corresponding role with the same practiced precision she'd spent 4 years developing. She smiled at the right faces. She deflected the polite questions about her absence with the vague language of a brief illness and a rest cure. She accepted champagne she didn't drink and compliments she didn't hear, and she watched the doors. Thomas had gotten her message. She knew he had, because 3 days ago she'd found a small folded note tucked inside a fresh pair of gloves left on her dressing table, not by any of Elias's staff, which meant someone had gotten in and out of this house without being seen, which meant Ruth's network was exactly as capable as Ruth had implied. The note had 4 words: package secure. Wednesday, ready. Today was Wednesday. She just needed to get the key to the right person. The key to the drop box was sewn into the lining of her left glove. She'd done it herself 3 nights ago with a sewing needle she'd extracted from a loose hem in the curtain. Her hands had been completely steady. She'd surprised herself with that. Elias was across the room, talking to 2 men she recognized as railroad executives. He glanced at her every few minutes, monitoring. She met his eyes pleasantly each time and looked away first, which she knew he read as submission and which she let him read that way. Every piece of information he had that was wrong was a piece she could use. The quartet shifted into a waltz. Couples moved toward the floor. The crowd near Clara redistributed itself, opening lanes through the room as people either paired up or stepped back. She took a half step toward the nearest pillar to find better sight lines to the main entrance. And then there was a man standing in front of her, dark navy suit. No military bearing, but no softness either. A controlled stillness, silver watch chain. A scar at the edge of his collar where the fabric didn't quite reach. She didn't react. She was very proud of that. His eyes were steady and his expression was the open, mildly interested expression of a man attending a party he finds moderately pleasant. And absolutely nothing about him, said I. Crawled out of a burning cabin 2 weeks ago, except for the fact that she knew exactly what his voice sounded like, and it was coming out of his mouth right now. Mrs. Sterling, a slight incline of the head. I believe we were introduced at the Billings Land Conference. Fletcher from Nevada. He extended his hand. She took it. Of course, Mr. Fletcher. How lovely that you could attend. His hand closed over hers and held it a beat longer than a handshake required. Would you honor me with this dance? He said. She let him lead her to the floor. They joined the waltz, 3 couples in, moving into the pattern smoothly, his right hand at her back and her left in his right. And she felt him adjust the hold immediately, not pulling her closer, not using the conventional frame. He gave her 2 more inches of distance than the dance required. Room, space she hadn't asked for, and he'd given anyway. They moved through the first full rotation without speaking. She watched over his shoulder. He watched over hers. 2 people surveilling the same room from opposite angles. Elias is looking, she said quietly. I see him. His voice was lower than it would carry to anyone around them. Guard by the east entrance moved 20 minutes ago. The one on the south staircase is rotating. There's a gap at 11:15. Thomas, in position. He has the ledger. A pause. Judge Hargrove arrived an hour ago. He's in the library. The library? Of course. Hargrove had a reputation for avoiding the social theater of these events and spending the gala portion of the evening in the host book collection. Elias had always found it irritating. Tonight, it was going to be the most useful room in the building. I can get to Hargrove, she said. I know this house. I know which corridor gets me to the library without going through Elias's sightline. I'll get the ledger from Thomas at 11:15 and follow. 3 minutes, she said. Give me 3 minutes with Hargrove before you come in. His hand pressed once, briefly, against her back. Yes. They turned through another rotation. The music was beautiful. She noticed distantly. It was genuinely beautiful. And they were moving through it in the middle of a ballroom, full of people who had no idea what was happening. And there was something almost absurd about that. You're all right, he said, low. Not a question exactly. I've been planning for 10 days, she said. I'm more than all right. She felt him exhale, a small thing. She felt it through his hand at her back. The scar, she said carefully. Significant, he said. I'm keeping it. Good. She meant that. You look well in Navy. Ruth picked it. I'll tell her she has good instincts. She already knows. The waltz was building toward its end. She could feel the musical phrase climbing. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the couples on the floor separated and the moment dissolved. She turned her wrist slightly in his grip, and her fingers found the edge of her left glove. She worked the small seam she'd left open, felt the cold edge of the key, and transferred it to his palm in a single motion so smooth and ordinary that it looked like nothing, like two people holding hands in a dance. His fingers closed. 11:15, she said. 11:15, he said. The music finished. The couples separated. Clara stepped back and gave him a pleasant, social smile, the kind that meant nothing and was designed to mean nothing, and turned away. She didn't look at Elias. She moved toward the south corridor and disappeared into it. And behind her, the ballroom went on glittering, and the quartet began again. And nobody in that room looked at a woman in a red dress walking calmly through a doorway and thought anything of it at all. Judge Hargrove was 63 years old and had the appearance of a man who had long since stopped being interested in impressing anyone. He was sitting in the library's leather wingback chair near the fire, with a glass of bourbon and a volume of territorial survey maps spread open on his knee when Clara opened the door. He looked up. He did not look annoyed. He looked, if anything, mildly curious. Mrs. Sterling, he said. Judge Hargrove. She came in and closed the door behind her. I have approximately 3 minutes before my husband notices where I am, so I'm going to speak quickly, and I'd be grateful if you'd hear me out. He set the maps down. He looked at her with the careful, measuring attention of a man whose entire professional life had been built on distinguishing truth from its substitutes. Speak, he said. She spoke. She told him about the land transactions, the forged federal patents, the Nakota territories signed over under false pretenses, the black homesteaders whose claims had been systematically removed from the Federal Registry between 1,878 and 1,882. She told him the names, the dates, the county offices where the paperwork had been altered. She told him about the ledger, what it contained, where it had been, where it was now. She told him all of it in 2.5 minutes without repeating herself once. Hargrove hadn't moved. You have the original ledger, he said. My associate is retrieving it now, and you're willing to testify. That's why I'm standing here. He studied her for a moment. You understand what you're doing. Completely, she said. The door opened. Silas came in with the ledger in his hand, and Thomas's description of the chain of custody, written out on a single page. He set both on the desk in front of Hargrove and stood back. Hargrove opened the ledger. The room was very quiet. The party sounds from 2 rooms over were muffled, distant, belonging to a different world. Hargrove turned pages slowly. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened once, and then again. And then he stopped at a particular page and put his finger on a line and looked up. This name, he said, is a federal land commissioner. Clara said, who accepted payment in 1,880 to remove 3 legitimate homestead claims from the registry. The payment amount and date are on the right column. Hargrove closed the ledger. He looked at Clara. He looked at Silas. He stood up and set his bourbon down on the mantelpiece with a precise, deliberate movement. I'm going to need you both to remain in this room, he said. I have 2 U.S. Marshals in attendance tonight. Don't leave, and don't let anyone in this room until I return. He went to the door. The door opened from the other side before he could reach it. Elias Sterling came through it the way he came through most things ahead of his people, controlled, already talking. He had two men behind him, and his expression had abandoned the warmth entirely. He looked at Clara, looked at the ledger in Hargrove's hand. Something worked through his face that she'd never seen there before. It took her a moment to identify it because she'd never seen it directed at her. Fear. Clara, he said. His voice was very level. Whatever you've told him is documented, she said page by page. He looked at Hargrove. Judge, I want to assure you that my wife is not well. She's been under significant mental strain, and her account of events can't be. Elias Hargrove's voice stopped him. Be quiet. Elias's mouth closed. Hargrove looked at the two men behind Elias. You can wait in the hall. His tone left no room. They went. That left Elias, and Clara, and Silas, and a judge holding a ledger in a room with a closed door. Elias looked at Silas for the first time. Something calculated moved through his eyes. Who are you, he said. Someone you hired, Silas said, and then tried to burn alive. Those are related facts. Elias turned back to Clara. He crossed the room toward her, and his voice dropped to the register he'd always used when there was no audience low. Precise. The real instrument under the performance. You think this finishes it. You think one ledger and a cooperative judge, I think, Clara said, that a jury is going to hear the names of every family you robbed. And I think those families deserve to hear the verdict. She looked at him steadily. I thought about it. Standing here, with the ledger in that man's hands, and you in this room, I thought about what you would do if our positions were reversed. Elias said nothing. She reached into the small bag she'd carried all evening and took out the revolver. She aimed it directly at the center of his face. Her hand was completely steady. He went very still. Death is too easy, she said. You're going to live long enough to watch the law strip away every single thing you ever stole. The land, the money, the name. She lowered the gun slowly. That's your sentence, and it starts tonight. The door opened, and the marshals came in. Elias turned to face them. He turned back once to look at Clara, and whatever he saw there made him go quiet in a way that nothing else had managed all evening. Then the marshals had his arms, and they walked him out, and the door was open, and from two rooms over the string quartet was still playing. Clara stood in the middle of the library with the gun at her side and listened to it for a moment. Then she set the gun on the desk next to Hargrove's bourbon. She was done carrying it for the night. They were out of Chicago before dawn. Not running. There was nothing left to run from. They simply had no interest in staying in the house, in the city, in the world of crystal chandeliers and gold drapes and parties that cost more to attend than most families earned in a year. Hargrove had what he needed. Thomas had signed his statement. Clara had given 3 hours of testimony in a hotel room to a court clerk, every word clear and precise and documented. And when it was done, she'd stood up and put on her coat and walked out the door. Silas was waiting on the street with 2 horses. She looked at him. Ruth's, she said. Ruth's first, he said then, wherever you want. She thought about it for approximately 1 second. Montana. They took the westbound train to Billings and rode the last stretch north through country that opened up around them as the city fell away, the flat urban grid giving way to distance, to sky, to the particular emptiness of the high plains in winter that wasn't empty at all once you learned to look at it right. Ruth met them at the trading post with coffee and no ceremony. She looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she pulled her into an embrace that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second longer. And when she let go, her expression was back to its usual settled directness. Hargrove's filing the injunctions this week. Thomas had told them before they left. The land reversions will take time. These things always do. But they'll happen. Ruth had heard it from Clara now, standing in the trading post with her hands around her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment. My sister's family, she said. It's in the ledger. Clara said, every detail. Hargrove has it. Ruth nodded once. She looked out the window at the snow. Then she looked back and said, good. Drink your coffee. They spent 2 days at the trading post. On the third morning, Clara and Silas rode north. The cabin site was a clearing of ash and snow. The fire had burned down to almost nothing in the weeks they'd been gone, and the snow had covered what remained. And what was left was the chimney standing alone in the middle of a white field, like a monument to something. They stood at the edge of it for a while, without speaking. "I want to rebuild here," Clara said. "All right, it's going to take time. Most worthwhile things do." She looked at the chimney. She looked at the tree line and the way the morning light came through the pines at this hour, gold and slanted, hitting the snow at an angle that made the whole field look like it was lit from underneath. She'd picked this cabin because it was remote, because no one would look for her here, because it was a place to hide. She thought about living here instead, actually living here, with intention, with someone, on ground she'd chosen, in a structure she'd helped build with her own hands. The difference between hiding and choosing felt enormous. She turned to Silas. He was looking at the clearing, calculating something she'd learned to recognize. That look, the practical internal inventory he ran before a task. 2 rooms, she said, at minimum. The original was too small. "We can use the chimney as the anchor wall. Build out east and north. I want windows on the south side. For the light. South windows." "Yes." She looked at him. He was standing in the winter morning, with his coat open despite the cold, and she knew it was because the left side was still tender, and layers added pressure. And he hadn't complained about it once. She knew about the scar, because she'd seen it when Ruth changed the dressing that first evening at the trading post. She'd been in the room, and he'd known she was in the room, and he hadn't flinched or angled away from her. She'd looked, and he'd let her look, and neither of them had said anything about it. He looked at her now, direct and open, the way he always was. "I want to show you something," she said. She took off her coat. The morning was cold enough to see her breath, and she stood in the open air in her shirt, and she reached back and worked the buttons at her collar and folded the fabric down from her shoulders. The scars were there, the diagonal lines from her left shoulder blade down. In the winter morning light, they looked exactly like what they were, marks left by someone who'd had power over her and had used it badly. They weren't hidden. They weren't a secret. They were just part of her, the way all the rest of her was part of her. She stood straight and let the light hit them. Silas looked. He didn't look away, and he didn't rush past it. He took it in the way she'd offered it fully, without pity, without performance. Then he opened his coat and pulled his shirt aside. His burn scar ran from his ribs up over his shoulder, raised and permanent, the territory of the fire permanently drawn on his skin. He stood in the same winter light and let her see it. They were quiet for a moment, just 2 people in a snowfield in the morning, showing each other what they carried. Then Clara pulled her shirt back up and buttoned her collar, and Silas closed his coat, and she picked up her coat from the ground and put it back on. "South windows," she said. "South windows," he said. They walked into the clearing together. Their boots made the first tracks in the clean snow, crossing toward the standing chimney, and the pines threw long blue shadows across the field. And somewhere out past the tree line, a hawk called once and was gone. The prairie wind moved through the grass at the clearing's edge, and it sounded the way freedom sounds when you've been without it long enough to know the difference. They had work to do. They got started. There's a moment near the end of this story that stays with you. Clara Vance is standing in a snowfield in Montana, in the cold morning light, and she takes off her coat. She reaches back and unbuttons her collar and lets the scars show. Not because someone asked her to, not because she had to, but because she decided to, on her own terms, in her own time. That's the whole story, right there in one image. We talk a lot about strength. We use the word constantly: strong woman, strong character, strong survivor. But this story asks a harder question. What does strength actually look like when it's been living inside someone who's been told for years that she has none? What does it look like when it's been quiet and patient and waiting, not because it was weak, but because the moment hadn't come yet? Clara wasn't saved by Silas. Let's be clear about that. She saved him, first pulled a bullet out of a stranger's side, tied his hands to her bed frame, and made the decision herself about whether he lived or died. Every step that followed was hers. The ledger, the plan, the timing. The moment in the library when she lowered the gun and chose justice over revenge. All of it was Clara. Silas walked beside her. He didn't carry her. And that distinction matters enormously, because one of the quiet, damaging things our stories have taught us over generations is that a woman in danger needs to be rescued. That her value in the narrative is in how much someone else wants to protect her. This story looks that idea directly in the face and says no. Clara's value is in what she thinks, what she plans, what she endures, and what she chooses. The man beside her is there because she allowed him to be there, because he earned it, because he understood from the very first night that the only correct thing to do was take 2 steps back and let her decide. That's what Silas represents, and it's worth naming plainly. He's not a perfect man. He spent years working for an institution that did real harm to real people, the labor unions, the railroad workers, black communities across the country. He knew it, and he left. And he carries that honestly, without asking for absolution. What he offers Clara isn't rescue. It's respect. It's the radical, simple act of treating her as someone fully capable of running her own life. Teaching her to shoot not as a gift, but as a right. Stepping back in that corner of the cabin, not because it was easy, but because her boundaries mattered more than his instinct to comfort. That's a lesson that goes far beyond the 1880s. Ruth carries a different lesson, and an equally important one. Here is a woman who walked out of Virginia in the winter of 1863 with nothing, built something real from nothing, taught herself the law, won her own fights in court, and then spent years quietly building a network capable of bringing down a man like Elias Sterling. Nobody handed Ruth her power. Nobody gave it back to her. She constructed it herself, piece by piece, out of knowledge and patience, and the unshakable understanding that justice is worth working toward even when it takes decades. And she never stopped. That's the thing about Ruth that gets under your skin. She never stopped. Thank you for being here for this story. If it meant something to you, share it. Because the stories we tell each other are how we remember what matters and what we still owe each other. We'll see you in the next one. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.